Imagine you could create the perfect coaching candidate from scratch. What qualities would you look for? Let's talk about it. Hi, I'm Aaron Muller, and welcome to Cobsmacked. This is a Nebraska football channel where we cover the Husker season and team news as it progresses throughout the year. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like it and be sure to subscribe to the channel as well so you don't miss more videos in the future. So before we get into this video, I do want to take a moment out to talk about Adrian Martinez and his game last night. So Kansas State went down to Norman and beat the number 6 Oklahoma Sooners. We just witnessed them pretty much curb stomp Nebraska in Memorial Stadium. But Kansas State went down there behind Adrian Martinez and they beat them. They pretty soundly beat them. It wasn't close. I mean, it was close score-wise, but Kansas State had that game in control for most of the game that I watched. So Adrian went out there and he scored 4 rushing touchdowns and 1 through the air. So he had a career high 5 touchdowns in that game. And looking back on his career at Nebraska, we've always seen that athleticism. And even after he left, he never badmouthed any of the coaches. He never badmouthed anybody. He has had a good character. I had nothing bad to say about him, and there's not a ton that people could say about him. Obviously, he has his haters and his critics that say like he didn't have a clutch gene while he was here, and he had a lot of turnovers. He was turnover prone. He was injury prone, things like that. But you could say that for a lot of the players that have come through Nebraska and they just haven't developed out how you thought they would, and then they go on somewhere else and they find success. So he gave everything while he was here for 4 years, and I do believe, same as everything else, that with better development and specifically a better offensive line, he would have found more wins here. All those games that were like slightly close and we were just that close to winning a game, we would have been over the edge had he had better set pieces around him. Again, people complain about that clutch gene missing, but we cannot rely on one guy, one athletic quarterback to win games for us. So it should never have fallen down to his shoulders to where he's the guy we're depending on every time. He's obviously the quarterback, but regardless, I wanted to say congrats to the artist formerly known as 2AM and wish him luck the rest of the season. But getting into this meat of this episode, I want to talk about creating your own personal coach, Frankenstein. So in the 1985 movie Weird Science, 2 high school boys used their supercomputer to create the perfect woman. They scanned a bunch of images in of their ideal qualities, their face, the eyes, the legs, other parts of a woman that a high school boy would put into a computer. But through a freak storm and some weird science, their ideal woman comes walking through the door. What if instead of a 24-year-old Kelly LeBrock, you could create your very own coach Frankenstein? What qualities would you have to have? What would you be scanning into the computer to have your perfect candidate? So here are my top 5 qualities that I would look for in a dream head coach. So first and foremost, he has to be a king of culture. All of the good teams that I've witnessed have had some semblance of a locker room leadership aspect to them. Internal leaders emerge from the locker room and they drive accountability and culture just as much as the staff does. So I think that that's going to be important for the coach coming in to try to establish something along those lines early on. John from Coordination mentioned a speech that was given in the 90s to the team, and I thought it was very interesting, so I dove a little bit more into that. Boyd Epley, the first strength and conditioning coach in the country, started at Nebraska in 1969, and he is recognized as the most decorated strength coach in history. During his 35 years here, he helped the team win 356 games and 5 national championships. But he talked to the group in the early 90s, and he kind of drew a pie chart on the board, and he said that there's three aspects to a locker room, 3 groups in a locker room that you could look at. He's like, there's the people that want to be here, there's the people that have to be here, and there's the people that just make it difficult for everybody else, and he called those guys the jerks. He said the first step to becoming a good team is to get rid of the jerks. So he's like, if you're not going to show up, if you don't want to be here, if you don't have to be here, if you're just here to make it hard for everybody else, he wanted them to leave. Obviously, nobody left. So he erased that portion of the pie chart and he said, okay, now we just have to motivate the have-tos into that want-to section. He didn't want anybody there that did not want to be there, that did not want to succeed and did not want to get better. But he wanted everybody on the same page, and that was a big motivating factor into them creating the Unity Council, which we'll get into in a little bit. But he did notice that the punishments didn't work. So guys were missing, strength sessions, weightlifting sessions, things like that. People were missing them because they would rather just deal with the punishment than show up. And so it wasn't a big deal if we missed 1 or 2 here and there. But he wanted to hold everybody accountable, regardless of if they were starting or if they were a walk-on. So if they missed a workout from this point on, they would be off the team. That was it. No gray area. If you miss a workout, you're off the team. If they choose not to participate, that's not on the coaching staff. That's not on anybody but themselves. They chose not to participate. They chose not to improve, and so they were off the team. They choose to leave the team at that point. So it was all about getting everybody committed to the team, everybody getting committed to the goals, and the players kind of holding themselves accountable to, pushing themselves to that next level. So this kind of inadvertently helped to form the Unity Council. Obviously, the coaching staff got on board with it as well, but a lot of the players started to notice, like, we're the ones that have to drive this forward. We're the ones that are going to have to hold each other accountable. So even outside the locker room, they started to really, really bond and become more like brothers than just, that guy plays football with me. And that holds up till now. Like, all these guys that were a part of those teams in the 90s, they still keep in contact. They're still talking to each other when they meet up. Like, it's like, meeting a brother. Like, there's no time lost for those guys. And that's the kind of, like, culture you need in your locker room. You need, like I mentioned, they're brothers. If your brother needs help, you're going to help him out. But if your brother needs an ass kicking, you're going to do that too before you ever go tell dad. So that's the kind of thing you want. You want guys that are going to push each other to succeed. And if they don't meet that expectation that everybody has for each other, then they're going to be the ones to kind of kick you into shape too. So having that culture also where it's not just the starters that are on this level or just the walk-ons that are being held to this like expectation, it's your third and fourth string guys as well. So everybody showed everybody respect in that locker room, regardless of their star rating, regardless of, their NIL deals, which they didn't have back then, but it's something you have to worry about now. Regardless of your status on the team, everybody's at the same level. Everybody deserves the same amount of respect, and everybody's there going for the same goals. So this cannot be understated how important building a culture like that in the locker room is. And the coach's job in all this, because I am pushing really hard that it's a player-driven accountability and kind of culture, the coach still has a job in that, and that is that he needs to identify the leaders in that room and push those guys and kind of push what he expects from the team and his goals and cultural values that he wants to see from these guys, and push that to them so that they can push that out to the other players. So he needs to openly discuss the goals and let the entire team know that there's going to be a standard and that he has to stick to that. So he can't be holding his star running back to a different standard than he would the walk-on that's been here for 3 years. So again, if he misses a practice, if he misses a weightlifting session, he's not playing. So simple as that. Like, you have to be able to stick to your guns in that regard as well. And that's a tricky balance then of being kind of, indirect and off limits, but also not being too dominated. You want to be known as the firm dad figure, but you don't want to be known as the dictator that's kind of running the team that way. You want to lead by example and set expectation and show that this expectation can be met and it's expected to be there. So I'm not saying he needs to be nice by any means. A lot of people say, Tom Osborne, it was the epitome of a nice guy. That's not exactly how you have to be. That's not by any means. He was pretty much the only nice guy. Mike Riley, you could look at and say he was a nice guy, but he didn't have success with it. So if you're looking at successful coaches, Tom Osborne's one of the only nice guys that I've ever watched. Look at his predecessor, Bob Devaney, drank scotch, talked a bunch of shit. Like, he was unabashedly himself, but he had an expectation for his players, and he said what he meant. The players never had to wonder if he was lying or anything like that. He was authentic and he was unabashedly himself. So he needs to allow the leaders in the locker room to establish this culture of accountability while still kind of steering it in the right direction. It's a very hard thing to master, which is why a lot of programs don't have this culture kind of built into it. But players will run through a brick wall once you get that established. And you've seen that with Tom Osborne, Bob Devaney. Clemson has that. Minnesota has that. Like, if you can get the culture down, regardless of who is there, they're going to play for that coach because he is, the driving factor of that culture. So getting into the next aspect of the dream coach, he needs to be a three-headed recruiting monster. So I say three-headed in that it has to be aimed at high school, junior college, and transfer portal now as well. So he needs to not only be able to bring in that talent, but he needs to be able to entice the talent from high school. He needs to be able to entice the people from JUCO to take a look at him. He needs to be able to identify the JUCO things, because now that the transfer portal is kind of blown up to the state that is in right now, I think a lot of JUCO guys are going to get overlooked because there's not going to be a ton of schools looking into junior college as much as they were at transfer portal before. So They need to not entice just the big name recruits. They need to look at the diamond in the roughs. They need to look for the guys with the most potential upside as well. They can't just go for the 5-star that's now leaving because he's not starting anymore. They need to find that 3-star that just wasn't getting developed as well as he could have been at this school, and you can see his upside. And that's not just frame. I know a lot of coaches like to look at frame, like he has a good frame for this position, but you need to find guys that, again, want to be there. They want to play football and they want to do better. So being able to identify those people and being able to convince them to come to Nebraska, of all places, is hard, and it's getting more difficult than it was ever before. With NIL, people can literally go anywhere. They can, as long as they get a bag, they could go to the college down the road. So why come to Nebraska, of all places, when you could just go, an hour away from home and make, a few $1,000s? So the big schools still have traditions and stadiums, nice facilities, an education if you're into that kind of thing as a player. But again, if that college down the road can make you a decent offer and you get the chance to stay closer to home, why wouldn't you take that? So college is no longer just a stepping stone to the NFL where you can make money. You can make money now. And so I think that's a huge shift for a lot of players, especially the players that don't necessarily have an NFL future. You have guys that are good at football, but they know that they're not going to be good enough to get to the NFL. So why walk on at Nebraska if you can go somewhere else and make some money while you are playing football? So obviously this affects the big name recruits, but it's a bigger impact at depth, I think, at the talent at depth. So you can have star players come in, but if you can't convince walk-on guys to come in, or even your third and fourth string guys to come in, if they're not, at least slightly below the guys behind you, you can't have a steep drop off between your starters and your next guys. You have to have some kind of consistency, some kind of tier group there where you're having talent even lower on so that you can develop those guys up. Teams that consistently bring in top recruiting classes consistently finish near the top. Ohio State, Alabama, Georgia, all these. Texas doesn't necessarily always finish at the top, but they have a good pool to pull from, and they consistently have shots at games. So obviously there's more to a team than just talent, but raw talent can literally raise the ceiling of a team overnight. So once the talent shows up, you do have to know what to do with it, though. So we're going to get into the third aspect of my dream coach, which would be he needs to be able to develop guys. So the culture and the recruiting tie deeply into this part, which is why the other two had to come first. But if you're brought into a family full of talent that thrives on pushing each other to getting better and constantly improving, you're bound to meet those same standards. You're bound to kind of just slide in, and this is how things are run here, and you want to play, so this is how we have to do it. It's almost a culture of constant development. Dr. Rob Zatitska talked about the depth at Nebraska being crazy looking back on it now. He said not only were the starting guys NFL level guys, but even the backups and even the third string guys were NFL level guys as well. So I don't think that's a coincidence. I don't think that they got recruited and that they were already at an NFL level. I think that they came in and the guys ahead of them were very talented, and so they had to get up to that level to even fight for playing time. I'm sure a lot of the people on the 90s teams were highly recruited, and I know a lot of them were, but there was also guys that walked in and they wanted to compete for that starting job. They wanted to push everybody up. But walking into an atmosphere where iron sharpens iron it's constantly going to, rub off on you if you are the guy behind the starter. Even if you're the third string guy down, you're still competing with the guy next to you to try to get that starting spot. So as he gets better, you're going to get better just by default. So although everybody was competing for playing time, as I mentioned, nobody was sabotaging anybody else. Nobody's like trying to injure the guy next to him. Nobody's, just trying to make him worse, because that doesn't necessarily bring your game up at all. There was more back patting than backstabbing. So as the guy next to you is getting better, you're going to get better too. And I think that, again, culture ties into this. So having a deep level of respect, but having a competitive rivalry with the guys around you, it pushes everybody in that locker room further. A rising tide lifts all boats kind of mentality. So you want to play, what the level of the guy ahead of you is. So you're going to have to get up to there. You're going to have to adapt. You're going to have to overcome, and you're going to get better. So this all ties into development. And that's why the culture and the recruiting is so important, because if everybody comes in at the same level, it's not the same. If the guy ahead of you is better, that's going to push you to get better, which is going to push him to get better, because he doesn't want to lose that starting spot. So it pushes everybody to get better, regardless of if you're a starter or if you're a walk-on. But the coach's job in that as well is to identify the talent and make sure that he's pulling the most out of those guys. That it's vital for a successful program to be able to identify talent regardless of what level that talent is at, and be able to see what their potential is, what their ceiling is, and push them to that, and know that they have to know that they can get there. It can't be something that you see and they don't really, they don't really grasp what they can do with that. Whether that's through motivation, whether that's through physical improvement, technique, or even like flipping position completely. If you have a guy who's fast, but he's not necessarily good at catching crap, throw him at a cornerback. If you think that he will succeed in that position, that's worth a shot. That's worth telling him, you could make a shot here at getting better at this. You could be an All-American cornerback. You're not going to make it as a wide receiver here. So you have to be able to identify those things and, again, convince those guys, and they have to have enough trust in you. So it goes back to culture, that you're making a good decision for them. Again, whether they're walk-ons or a 5-star prodigy, the best coaches get the best out of their players, and they get better every week. So especially important to the positions that aren't so much plug and play, like those skill positions, but the ones that are going to take more time to develop, such as the line play, which is why my number 4 quality in a dream coach is that they're going to prioritize the trench warfare, the lines. So specifically the offensive line. If you've watched any of my videos, you know that I put so much weight on having a good offensive line. That's why it's so prevalent in a lot of my reviews and a lot of my recaps, is that our offensive line is kind of letting us down, that their offensive line is really good, and that's something we have to prepare for. I truly believe that a team lives or dies by its line play. And I mentioned before how raw talent can kind of raise the ceiling of your program overnight. The offensive line specifically is going to be the foundation of that house. So the raw talent is more prone to be accurate for the skill positions, such as your wide receivers, your cornerbacks, your running backs. You could have a true freshman come in and have a hell of a season at running back. AJ Allen, for example, last year, the guy from Wisconsin, Braylon, whatever his name was, he ran over everybody last year. And that's because the offensive line ahead of him was experienced and was able to push people open. But an offensive line can be considered that foundation, because if the foundation is solid and, or in exceptional cases, like I mentioned, Wisconsin or Minnesota, it automatically elevates the entire house. It elevates the entire floor. So you're not going to be able to go below that. If you have a good offensive line, your offense is already good. Like, there's no bad teams if they have a good offensive line. You can run 3 or 4 yards at a pop if you have a good offensive line. You don't need to be really necessarily good at anything else. And that's kind of what Wisconsin and Iowa and Minnesota have made their bread and butter on in the last few years, is just being known for being able to run the ball. Imagine, for instance, Grant being behind Wisconsin or Minnesota's offensive line right now. We know he is a star player and he's raising that ceiling. He's raising the potential for this offense to go off. What if he had an offensive line ahead of him? He could explode so much more than he does now. So the foundation needs to be there, and the ceiling can grow even more than it would normally. So the problem is that the offensive line is all about experience and chemistry. And if one link in that chain fails, then the entire unit is compromised. So experience and chemistry take time, and that's the issue. So, and development, as we mentioned before. The average starting lineman in the Big Ten has an average experience level of 3.5 years. Nebraska has been significantly below that at just over 2 years of experience, because we have guys leaving to the NFL early, or we have guys getting injured, or we have guys getting popped for drug stuff. You have a lot of freshmen and sophomores and juniors now in there. But either way, we're way behind. We're trying to play catch up to the most vital piece of the offense, in my opinion, and it hasn't panned out well. You look at basically any of our losses in the last 6 years, the offense can be blamed. The offensive line can be blamed a lot for that. Not necessarily, it's not their fault. They just don't have the experience. They don't have the size, because a lot of those guys are freshmen. They're coming in from high school, and they don't have the experience to be playing against these Big Ten guys that have been playing for 3 or 4 or 5 years at this point. So basically, a well-established offensive line gives us a better chance to win, more so than any other area on the team, in my opinion. And so they have to be able to identify that needs to be the first thing that you come in and you try to get to an elite level, is your offensive line. Behind that, everything else will kind of just fall into place. So this might be up there as far as culture goes as the most important quality, but I put it here at 4 because we had to talk about development. We had to talk about culture as well before we got to this point, because he doesn't necessarily need to bring he doesn't necessarily have to come in with offensive line experience. He doesn't have to be an offensive line coach or even an offensive coordinator, but he needs to understand that there is a a need. It is not like we'll focus on the offensive line, but we got to focus on quarterback too. Like offensive line needs to come first in my mind. He doesn't have to have experience in that regard. He just needs to have an understanding that the offensive line is vital to the offense to succeed. And again, that kind of comes down to a culture thing of everybody's important. It's not just the star guys. Could you name an offensive lineman? I couldn't name an offensive lineman before I started doing this show, besides the ones that mess up all the time. So you hear a lot of names getting thrown out there, but if a unit is doing well, you don't hear about them because they're kind of just doing their job. They're doing what is expected, and you don't necessarily hear names of. There's not a whole lot of star offensive linemen. So you need to be able to recruit linemen not just because they're stars, but because you can see that it's important to the team. He needs to be willing to put those recruiting resources to them, and then also the time into developing them as well. So defensive line is just important for the same reasons. If a team was able to line it up and run it down your throat, it is over. So for the exact opposite reasons that an offensive line is important, a defensive line is just as important to disrupt the opponent's offensive line. So it doesn't matter how well you can defend a pass. If you don't have a competent defensive line and they can just run it at you, it doesn't matter anyway. So this is why establishing a run game is like the first step in a lot of coaches' game plans for games. If you can run it, you don't need to rely on the passing quarterback at all. So this is why it's kind of the first thing that the defense tries to shut down and the offense tries to get going. On the flip side, if your defensive line is able to break through that offensive line and pressure the quarterback, it influences every aspect of the game, whether that be the pass timing, the QB stress level because he doesn't know if he's going to get hit. Even just the handoff to the running back is going to be kind of compromised because if your guys are getting back there very quickly, it just throws everything off. So having a good defensive line is just as important as an offensive line. I take that back. Offensive line still number one, but defensive line is very close behind that. Nebraska has just been losing battles up front for a very long time on both sides of the ball, and it seems that we have been prioritizing those skill positions, the wide receivers, the defensive backs, the safeties, the quarterbacks. We want these fast guys. We want these high star guys, these high recruited guys, but we're not getting the offensive linemen or the defensive linemen for those guys to shine behind. It doesn't matter how athletic or how strong or how good those guys look on film, but if you have a bad line in front of them, they're not going to be able to get a chance to show what they're able to do. They're going to be ineffective and they're not going to be able to produce. And so then you're going to start thinking, well, maybe that guy's not as good as he looked on film, or maybe he wasn't, he was just kind of a bust. But I think a lot of it has to do with, again, look at Adrian Martinez. We talked about him earlier. If you have an offensive line that he can feel comfortable behind and he can step up into, he wasn't known as a pocket quarterback, but you watched him last night and he stepped up in the pocket and he still threw it. So he didn't have a pocket here to throw in. So that just throws everything off. So if you have lines that guys can get behind and show off their skill set, then that just, that kind of ups everybody's game behind them. As mentioned, building great lines is about consistency and experience. And with the current transfer portal free agency market that goes on right now, it's even more important. Guys need to believe that even if they're not going to start right away, they need to trust the coach, trust the culture here, that he's going to make them the best player possible and he will give them the best opportunity to succeed, whether that be making a national championship, or if you do want to get to the NFL, you need to be able to trust that even if you're not starting your first 2 years, your last 2 years, you're going to have developed into such a player that you're going to get looked at and you're going to make it into the league. So getting into the last quality that I want to see in a dream coach is that I like defensive-minded coaches, so that's kind of a must-have for me. The old saying that defense wins championships has always held true to me. Of course, there are exceptions where the offenses are just so explosive that they overwhelm the opposition. You look at like 2019 LSU, they kind of just blew everybody out of the water, and there was really no slowing them down. That doesn't always happen. That's kind of the exception to that rule. So having an elite defense will always keep your team in games. Blowouts will be more rare, so if you can immobilize defenses or offenses, then you're more likely to have your offense give your offense a chance to succeed. Of course, you're going to struggle if your offense can't score, but kind of looking at Iowa currently. But let's say both sides of the ball are competent. They're at the same exact level, and a genie came to you and said, we're going to elevate one of these to elite status. Which one are you choosing? Are you choosing offense or are you choosing defense? An elite offense would obviously put up a ton of points. They would be fun to watch. They'd be exciting. You'd have a lot more shootout games. Like think Texas and Oklahoma in 2020. They went into 4 overtimes and they scored a combined 98 points. Ton of fun to watch, but their defenses were bad. They could not get stops, and the offenses were expected to constantly score. If you went a drive and you didn't come away with any points, that put you at a risk of falling behind very quickly because the offenses were just back and forth and back and forth. If you miss a chance to score, then you give the opportunity for the other team to go up by 2 scores and then by 3 scores. And we know that momentum is a huge factor in all this. So I think that you should rely on the defense there. So if you could elevate that defense to the elite level, if you can consistently rely on that defense to keep the score low, it takes a ton of pressure off the offense. It means that you're never going to be too far behind to catch up. So wins never get too far out of reach. You're not going to get blown out. If you allow the other team to score 14 and you're kind of averaging 14 a game, like that's not hard to score 14 points in a game, especially if your offense is competent. So even scoring just once a quarter puts you up to 28 points a game. And if you have an elite level defense, 28 points a game is plenty to get you by in a ton of games. It sets the bar pretty low even then. But it puts you in a great position to win a lot of games, and it's just the way it goes. So I would prefer to have a coach who comes in with defensive experience or at least has a good defensive mind to where he has a coordinator that is able to stop these. I would prefer a defensive coordinator that became a head coach. I prefer that. Like that's seems to be working. Look at Venables is at Oklahoma. Obviously they lost last night, but I still have a lot of respect for how he runs his defenses, just the way that they play, the way that they rip at the ball and they try to go for interceptions. Again, that kind of allows your offense, if your offense is competent, that's such a momentum flip for you to like get a fumble recovery or get an interception or get a safety and get the ball back to your offense. That does 2 things, that like gut punches the opposition. They lose momentum, they lose hope, they can't move the ball on you, and then you're giving your offense a chance to go down and score. Okay, now we're going to take all 5 of these qualities that I was looking for in a dream coach, and we're going to throw it in the machine, and it's going to spit out some gnarly looking middle-aged dude who looks like he could drink you under the table and then proceeds to challenge you to an arm wrestling contest. Come game day, though, he's going to have his guys ready to play. He's going to have them wanting to play for him, and they're going to go out there and they're going to play physical, hard-nosed football. And it's not going to stop. The motivation is not going to drop off because it gets to 3rd and 4th quarter. They're going to be playing because they want to be there. They want to beat you. They have such a competitive drive because their practices are so competitive themselves that the games are going to be just as easy for them. You hear that a lot, and that's just the way it is. But with Coach Frankenstein at the helm, you're going to get a turnover from your 3rd string safety towards the end of the game, and that's going to allow your offense to go down and march 70 yards behind 5 offensive linemen who are going to go into the league next year, and your backup running back is going to go in and score the final touchdown, putting the score at 66-3 against Alabama in the season opener. A man can dream, can he? So that's going to wrap up this week's episode. I had a ton of fun with what I would want to see in a head coach. Obviously, these are 5 qualities that are hard to hit. They are hard to pull out of a staff, let alone one man, which is why having a staff around your head coach, your coach might be able to be building a great culture, which again is the number one thing. If he's able to build a staff of guys around him that hit all 4 of the other qualities, you're going to have a great team. So again, Coach Frankenstein doesn't exist, but having all of these things to look at and say that this is what I want from my coach, not necessarily in my coach, this is what I want from my coach for the team. I think that that's a fun exercise to do. So if you could put 5, ideal qualities of a coach into a machine and get one out, what 5 qualities are you looking for in a head coach? What would you get out of your coach Frankenstein? I had I said, I had a ton of fun putting the video together, but let me know down below or on Cobsmacked Media at Twitter, Twitter at Cobsmacked Media. Let me know what you would put into head coach there, and let me know what you thought about the video. I've been, again, getting back into this and working on it, but until next time, go Big Red.